The night shift at Forward Operating Base Kandahar's field hospital belonged to Sarah Mitchell, and she preferred it that way. While other nurses complained about the graveyard hours, fighting exhaustion and longing for daylight, Sarah volunteered for every overnight rotation. The darkness was her comfort, her sanctuary, her hiding place. She moved through the dimly lit corridor between surgical tents with the silent grace of a predator, though no one would ever describe the petite blonde nurse in those terms. Her sneakers made no sound on the plywood flooring. Her scrubs, faded blue, slightly too large, hung on her lean frame like borrowed clothes. At 32, Sarah had the kind of face that people forgot easily. Pleasant but unremarkable, with warm hazel eyes that crinkled when she smiled, which wasn't often. "You're like a ghost," Corporal Davies had told her once, his leg wrapped in fresh bandages after shrapnel removal. "I never hear you coming. Just look up and boom, there you are with more morphine." Sarah had smiled that small, careful smile she'd perfected. "That's the point. You should rest, not listen for footsteps." But Davies had been more right than he knew. Ghost was exactly what Sarah was trying to be, a phantom of her former self, haunting these tents in penance. Tonight the hospital was mercifully quiet. Only 7 patients occupied the 20 beds, 3 Afghan civilians caught in crossfire, 2 soldiers recovering from a vehicle rollover, and 2 cases of severe dehydration. Sarah checked each one with methodical precision, her hands steady as she adjusted IVs and monitored vital signs. Those hands, they were what the other nurses noticed most, never trembling, even during the worst traumas. Never hesitating when a soldier screamed, or when blood sprayed across her scrubs. "How do you stay so calm?" Lieutenant Chen had asked during Sarah's first week, after they'd spent 3 hours trying to save a soldier who'd stepped on a mine. The case was hopeless from the start, too much damage, too much blood loss. Sarah had worked mechanically, efficiently, her face an emotionless mask even as Chen sobbed in the bathroom afterward. "Experience," Sarah had answered, which was true, just not the kind of nursing experience Chen imagined. The other nurses whispered about her. Sarah knew this, heard the fragments of conversation that died when she entered the break room. They'd created elaborate theories. Maybe she'd lost someone in combat. Maybe she was running from a bad relationship. Maybe she was just strange, one of those intense loners who gravitated toward war zones because they couldn't function in normal society. All of their theories were wrong, and all of them were right. Sarah stepped out of the main tent into the cool Afghan night, letting the door flap close behind her. The base was quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional crackle of radio chatter from the guard towers. She pulled a cigarette from her pocket. She didn't smoke, never had, but holding one gave her an excuse to stand outside and observe. The perimeter fence stood 300 yards away, wrapped in razor wire and lit by floodlights that created pockets of harsh brightness against the darkness. Beyond that fence lay a world Sarah understood better than most: hostile territory, potential threat lines, natural cover positions. She cataloged it all automatically, her eyes scanning the distant hills where Taliban fighters hid during the day. A gust of wind carried dust across the compound, and Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her shoulder, pressing against the fabric of her scrubs. Beneath the material, hidden from everyone, was a tattoo she'd gotten a lifetime ago, a skull with crosshairs, wrapped in a Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor. The words "one shot, one kill" curved beneath it. She'd looked into laser removal twice but never followed through. Some scars were meant to stay. "Mitchell, you out here?" Sarah turned to see Dr. Patel emerging from the surgical tent, his dark eyes tired behind wire-rimmed glasses. The chief surgeon was a good man, dedicated, skilled, and perpetually exhausted. He'd been at the field hospital for 9 months, 3 months longer than Sarah. "Just getting some air," she said, pocketing the unlit cigarette. "The Williams kid is asking for more pain meds. I know we just gave him some 2 hours ago, but—" "I'll check on him," Sarah interrupted gently. "Could be breakthrough pain. I'll assess and adjust if needed." Patel nodded gratefully. "You're the best night nurse we've had. I don't know what we'd do without you." Sarah felt the familiar twist of guilt in her stomach. "If you knew who I really was, you wouldn't say that." As Patel headed back inside, Sarah allowed herself one more moment in the darkness. Somewhere in the hills, a dog barked. Somewhere closer, a generator coughed and sputtered. And somewhere deep inside Sarah Mitchell's carefully constructed walls, a warrior waited in uneasy sleep. She didn't know it yet, but that warrior was about to wake up. Because in a small compound 15 miles away, 12 Taliban fighters were loading weapons into a stolen truck. They'd been watching the hospital for weeks, mapping the guard rotations, counting the security personnel, identifying the weakest points in the fence. Tomorrow night, technically tonight since it was already past midnight, they would attack. They expected soft targets, doctors, nurses, wounded soldiers. Easy prey. They had no idea that among those nurses was a woman who had once been nicknamed the Angel by her Marine platoon. Not because she was merciful, but because she delivered death so quietly, so efficiently, that enemies never saw her coming. Sarah crushed the cigarette beneath her heel and walked back toward the hospital, her footsteps silent, her face calm. Just another quiet night shift for the ghost nurse. But the night after this one would be different. The night after this one, everyone would learn who Sarah Mitchell really was. And by then, it would be far too late to run. The signs were everywhere, screaming warnings that only Sarah could hear. It started 3 days before the attack, though Sarah wouldn't connect all the pieces until it was too late. She was walking back from the mess tent when she noticed the motorcycles, 2 of them, dusty red Honda dirt bikes circling the perimeter road just beyond the fence. Nothing unusual about motorcycles in Afghanistan, they were as common as dust. But these riders moved with purpose, their heads turning at precise intervals, studying the guard towers, the gate, the gaps in surveillance. SARAH's Chinese letter slowed instinctively. Her eyes tracked their movement with the kind of tactical awareness that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. Reconnaissance pattern, classic 2-man surveillance team. They're mapping our defenses. She almost said something, almost walked directly to the security office and reported what she'd seen. But then she'd have to explain how she knew what a reconnaissance pattern looked like, why a nurse could identify tactical surveillance, what training had taught her to read the language of pre-attack preparation. So she said nothing. She crushed that instinct down, locked it away with all the other parts of herself she'd buried, and kept walking. The motorcycles came back the next day. Same time, 1,430 hours, right during the shift change when the fewest guards were actively monitoring. Sarah was helping Mrs. Ahmadi, a local woman recovering from appendix surgery, when she glanced out the tent window and saw them again. Different riders this time, but the same deliberate circling, the same careful observation. "Nurse Sarah," Mrs. Ahmadi touched her arm gently, "you look worried." Sarah forced her face into a calm mask, the one she'd perfected over 4 years of pretending. "Just tired. How's your pain level?" But she wasn't tired. She was screaming inside, every nerve ending firing warnings that everyone else seemed deaf to. They're building a pattern of life assessment. Next comes timing analysis, then vulnerability mapping. This is textbook pre-assault reconnaissance. That evening, during the security briefing she normally never attended, Sarah stood in the back of the room and listened. Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, 24 years old, fresh-faced, from some small town in Kansas, stood at the front with the confidence of someone who'd never seen real combat. "Security posture remains green," he announced cheerfully, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that made Sarah's teeth clench. "No credible threats in the immediate area. Taliban activity has actually decreased by 15% this week, according to SIGINT." Because they've gone dark preparing for an operation, Sarah thought. Decreased chatter isn't a good sign. It's a red flag the size of Texas. She raised her hand. Every head turned toward her. The nurses never came to security briefings. Lieutenant Reeves looked startled. Yes, Nurse Mitchell. The motorcycles, Sarah said carefully. The ones that have been circling our perimeter for 2 days. Same time, same pattern. Has anyone logged those? Reeves blinked. Motorcycles, I mean there are always motorcycles around here. It's Afghanistan. A few soldiers chuckled. These ones are different, Sarah pressed, feeling herself sliding toward a cliff edge. They're conducting surveillance, systematic timed passes, building a pattern of life assessment. The room went quiet. Several soldiers exchanged glances. Captain Williams, the base security officer, leaned forward with interest and suspicion. That's pretty specific tactical language for a nurse, Williams said slowly. You have military experience, Mitchell. Sarah felt the trap closing. If she admitted her background, she'd have to explain why she'd hidden it. Why a trained Marine Scout sniper was working as a nurse instead of in uniform. The questions would never stop, and the past she'd worked so hard to bury would explode into the present. My brother was Army, she lied smoothly. I picked up some terms, I'm probably wrong. Sorry for interrupting. She left before anyone could ask more questions, her heart pounding. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. Coward, she thought. You see the signs and say nothing because you're afraid of your own shadow. But it was more than that. Speaking up meant admitting she was still a warrior, still saw the world through a sniper's eyes, still carried the weight of 27 kills everywhere she went. She'd come here to heal, to atone, to prove she could be something other than death wrapped in camouflage. The third day, the signs multiplied. Old man Hamidi, who sold chai and bread to the base staff, didn't show up. His nephew came instead, nervous and jumpy, making excuses about his uncle being sick. Sarah knew better. The locals always knew when something was coming. They pulled back, kept their families away, waited for the storm to pass. The Afghan interpreters were next. During lunch, Sarah noticed Farid and Massoud huddled in urgent conversation, their phones clutched tightly. When she passed their table, they stopped talking abruptly. Farid wouldn't meet her eyes. Everything okay? She asked. Fine, Farid said too quickly. Just family news. But Sarah saw the fear. She'd seen it before, in Iraqi villages right before insurgent attacks. The locals always knew. Information traveled through channels that coalition forces could never tap into, whispers in mosques, coded messages in markets, warnings passed through family networks. That afternoon, the gunfire in the hills changed. For weeks, it had been sporadic, undisciplined, local fighters taking potshots at drones or firing at nothing in particular. But today, the shots came in disciplined 3-round bursts, training fire, combat rehearsals. Sarah stood on the hospital steps, listening to the distant cracks echoing across the valley. She mapped the sounds instinctively, 4 different positions, coordinated timing, overlapping fields of fire. They're rehearsing an assault, multiple teams practicing synchronized engagement. She pulled out her phone and actually started typing a message to Captain Williams. Her thumbs hovered over the screen. Sir, I have concerns about security. The tactical indicators suggest. She deleted it. What could she say that wouldn't expose her? How could she explain that she recognized the acoustic signature of pre-assault training fire? That she could map enemy positions by sound alone? That every instinct honed through years of hunting humans was screaming that an attack was imminent? Dr. Patel found her there, staring at her blank phone screen. You all right, Sarah? You seem tense lately. Just tired, she lied again. Well, get some rest. We've got a big trauma coming in tomorrow night, 12 casualties from an IED strike. Going to be all hands on deck. Sarah nodded, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Tomorrow night, of course. The hospital would be chaotic, understaffed, focused entirely on saving lives. Guards would be distracted. Response times would be slow. It was the perfect moment for an attack. She almost told Patel everything right then. Almost confessed that she wasn't just a nurse, that she could read battlefields like books, that every sign pointed toward catastrophe. But she didn't, because Sarah Mitchell had spent 4 years running from who she used to be, and admitting the truth meant accepting that she'd never escaped at all. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah sat on her bunk and cleaned her hands with obsessive precision, scrubbing until they were raw. These hands had healed and killed in equal measure. Tomorrow, she would use them to save the wounded from the IED. She had no idea that by tomorrow night, she'd be using them to kill again. The storm was gathering, and Sarah Mitchell, former Marine Scout sniper, now just a quiet night nurse, was the only one who saw it coming. And the only one who said nothing. The 12 casualties arrived at 2:23 a.m. in a convoy of Humvees, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Sarah heard them before she saw them. The screaming started even before the vehicles stopped. "Mascal, Mascal," someone shouted. "We need all hands now." The night shift exploded into controlled chaos. Sarah was already moving, her body responding with the automatic efficiency of countless traumas. Dr. Patel burst from his quarters, still pulling on his scrubs. Lieutenant Chen appeared, hair disheveled, eyes wide with adrenaline. 2 medics from the day shift ran in to help. The wounded came in waves. A sergeant with half his face blown away, still somehow conscious and fighting the medics. A private missing his left arm below the elbow, the tourniquet applied in the field already soaked through. A specialist with shrapnel wounds across his chest, each breath bubbling with blood. 3 Afghan civilians caught in the blast. A woman, an old man, a boy who couldn't be more than 14. "Sarah, triage," Patel shouted over the chaos. She moved between the wounded with swift precision, her hands checking pulses, assessing injuries, tagging each patient with brutal efficiency. Red tag, immediate surgery needed. Yellow tag, serious but stable. Black tag, expectant, beyond saving. She tried not to look at the faces when she attached the black tags. The hospital became a symphony of controlled panic. Doctors shouted orders. Nurses ran between patients. The Afghan interpreters helped calm the civilian casualties. Blood pooled on the floor, making the plywood slick and treacherous. The smell of torn flesh and explosive residue filled the air, a scent Sarah knew intimately, though she wished she didn't. She was elbow-deep in a chest wound, trying to clamp a severed artery, when every light in the hospital went out. The darkness was absolute, total, suffocating. For one heartbeat, there was silence. Then the screaming started, patients confused and terrified, nurses calling out to each other, someone shouting to find the backup generator. Sarah's hands never stopped moving. In the darkness, her fingers found the artery by feel alone, clamped it, tied it off. Years of training in a different life had taught her to work without sight. A sniper learned to trust touch as much as vision. Then came the sound that turned her blood to ice. Whoosh boom! The RPG hit the generator building with a thunderous explosion that shook the entire compound. Sarah dropped flat instinctively, covering her patient's body with her own. In the flash of the explosion, she saw everything in stark relief. The shocked faces of her colleagues, the gaping wounds of the patients, the shadows of armed men outside the tent. "Contact, contact," a guard's voice screamed from somewhere outside. Then the gunfire started. Not the scattered, undisciplined fire of panicked defenders. This was professional, coordinated. 3-round bursts from multiple positions, overlapping fields of fire creating a deadly crossfire. Sarah's tactical brain cataloged it all automatically. AK-47s, at least 4 shooters, probably more. They'd breached the perimeter on the north side where she'd seen the weak point 3 days ago. "I tried to warn them," she thought with bitter clarity. "I saw this coming." "Get down," she shouted to her colleagues. "Everyone on the floor now." Most obeyed. Dr. Patel dove behind a medical cart. Lieutenant Chen scrambled under a supply table. But the hospital coordinator, Mr. Reynolds, a civilian contractor from Texas, stood frozen in the center aisle, his face pale with incomprehension. "Mr. Reynolds, get down!" Sarah screamed. He turned toward her voice just as the tent flap burst open. An insurgent in dark clothing rushed in, his AK-47 raised. Sarah saw it happening in slow motion, saw the barrel swing toward Reynolds, saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. Reynolds raised his hands. "Wait, we're medical, we're just—" The insurgent fired a 3-round burst into his chest. Reynolds dropped like a puppet with cut strings, blood spreading across his polo shirt with the hospital logo still visible. Sarah's world shifted. The nurse receded. Something else emerged, something cold and calculating that had been sleeping for 4 years. Her vision sharpened. Her breathing steadied. Every sound became crystalline. The scrape of boots on plywood, the metallic click of magazines being changed, the whispered commands in Pashto outside the tent. 4 tangos in the compound, more coming. They're executing a coordinated assault. Strike team clearing the tents, overwatch positions on the perimeter, probably a security element holding the breach point. Professional operation. Well planned. The tactical assessment came unbidden, unwanted but utterly accurate. Another insurgent entered the tent, sweeping his weapon left and right. He shouted something in Pashto, probably ordering everyone to stay down. Sarah remained motionless, her face pressed to the blood-slick floor, but her mind was racing through scenarios. No security response. The guards are dead or pinned down. Nearest backup is 15 minutes away minimum. These men will execute everyone in this hospital before help arrives. The patients can't run. The staff won't fight. Everyone here dies unless— "No, please." The scream came from the surgical tent. Sarah recognized the voice, Corporal Davies, the soldier who'd called her a ghost. Through a gap in the tent wall, she saw his silhouette as insurgents dragged him from his bed. His leg was still in a cast from the surgery 2 days ago. "I'm wounded. I'm no threat. Please, I have a—" The gunshot cut off his words. His body slumped. Someone in the surgical tent began sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her fingernails cutting into her palms. The pain was distant, irrelevant. Inside her chest, something was breaking, or perhaps awakening. The wall she'd built between her past and present was cracking, crumbling, collapsing. They're executing the patients. They're killing the wounded. Outside, more gunfire, more screams. The attack was methodical, thorough. The insurgents were moving through each tent systematically. They'd reach the pediatric ward next, where 3 Afghan children were recovering from various injuries. Then the intensive care unit where the most critical patients lay helpless. Dr. Patel caught Sarah's eye from across the tent. His face was streaked with tears, his hands trembling. He mouthed something that looked like, "Help us." But what could a nurse do against trained fighters? The answer came from somewhere deep and dark inside her. A nurse can't do anything. But a Marine Scout sniper can kill every single one of them. Sarah began to crawl through the darkness, moving with the silent precision of a predator. Her colleagues thought she was hiding, seeking cover. They didn't know she was hunting. The tent flap near the supply entrance was only 15 feet away. Beyond that, the storage tent where extra equipment was kept. And in that storage tent, unless procedures had changed in the last few days, was a weapons locker. Marines on security rotation stored their rifles there during shift changes. She'd noticed it a week ago and forced herself to look away, to not think about the weapons so close, to not remember how a rifle felt in her hands. Now, crawling through blood and chaos, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would haunt her forever. She would break her vow. She would kill again. Because the alternative was watching everyone around her die. "Forgive me, Marcus," she thought, picturing her dead spotter's face. "I tried to be someone else. I really tried. But trying wasn't enough, not tonight." Tonight, the angel was coming back. And God help anyone who stood in her way. Sarah crawled through the darkness like a shadow, her body remembering movements she'd drilled 1,000 times in a life she'd tried to forget. Elbows in, hips down, controlled breathing. The screams from the surgical tent faded into background noise, not because she didn't care, but because caring would slow her down, and slow meant death. The distance to the supply tent entrance was only 15 feet, but it felt like crossing an ocean. Every second stretched into eternity. Behind her, she heard the insurgents speaking rapid Pashto into a radio. Ahead, through a gap in the tent wall, she could see the silhouette of the storage building. A hand suddenly grabbed her ankle. Sarah's body coiled to strike before she recognized the terrified face of Specialist Martinez, a medic she'd worked with dozens of times. His eyes were wide with fear, his lips forming silent words, "Don't leave us." She squeezed his hand once, the only comfort she could offer, then pulled free and kept moving. Martinez didn't understand. None of them could. They saw her crawling away and thought she was abandoning them, fleeing to save herself. They had no idea she was crawling toward violence, not away from it. The tent flap hung loose where an RPG fragment had torn it. Sarah slipped through into the cool night air, staying low, using the shadows. The compound was chaos, fires burning, tracer rounds lighting the darkness, bodies sprawled across the dirt. She counted 4 insurgents visible, but her tactical mind automatically calculated more, probably 12 to 15 total based on the coordinated fire patterns. Professional numbers, professional tactics. This wasn't some hastily organized raid. Someone had planned this operation carefully. "Someone like you used to plan operations," a voice whispered in her mind. Sarah pushed the thought away and sprinted across 20 yards of open ground to the storage tent. Every step felt like betrayal, of her vow, of Marcus's memory, of the person she'd tried to become. But with each step, the nurse receded further and the Marine Scout sniper emerged like a ghost, remembering how to haunt. The storage tent was dark and musty, packed with medical supplies, equipment crates, and there, in the back corner, a green metal weapons locker. Sarah's hands found it by memory as much as sight. The lock was a standard 4-digit combination that changed weekly. She'd never asked for the combination because nurses didn't need weapons. But she'd watched the Marines open it 100 times. Muscle memory from her previous life had cataloged every digit without her conscious mind registering. 0711, the lock clicked open. Inside, illuminated by distant firelight filtering through the tent, lay an M40A3 sniper rifle, the same model she'd carried through 3 tours. Matte black finish, Schmidt and Bender scope. The weapon looked like it had been pulled from her nightmares and made solid. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it. This was the moment, the point of no return. 4 years ago, on her last day in the Marine Corps, she'd field-stripped her rifle for the final time. She'd cleaned every component with obsessive care, then handed it to the armorer with hands that shook with grief and relief. As she walked away from the arms room, she'd made a vow: never again. I will heal instead of kill. I will save lives instead of taking them. She'd kept that vow through nursing school, through sleepless nights haunted by the faces of her 27 confirmed kills, through therapy sessions where she'd sobbed about the weight of all that death. She'd built a new identity from the ruins of the old one, believing, desperately, foolishly believing, that she could erase the killer and become only the healer. Now holding the rifle, Sarah understood the truth she'd been running from. You can't erase what you are. You can only choose how to use it. Her hands stopped trembling. With movements precise and automatic, she checked the weapon. Magazine seated, bolt action smooth, scope clear, 5 rounds loaded. Battlefield 0 probably set for 300 yards. Not ideal, but workable. A metal ammo can beside the locker held additional .308 rounds. She grabbed a handful, stuffing them in her scrub pockets. The transformation was physical. Sarah could feel it happening, her posture straightening, her breathing settling into the controlled rhythm of a shooter, her vision sharpening as her brain shifted into combat mode. The nurse's empathy and care dissolved, replaced by the cold calculation of a predator. Target assessment, range estimation, wind speed, elevation adjustments. The technical language flooded back effortlessly, as natural as breathing. She thought of Marcus, her spotter, blown apart by an IED while she survived without a scratch. She'd held him as he died, promising through tears that she'd never forget him, never stop fighting. But fighting was what had destroyed her soul, so she'd stopped. She'd run. She'd hidden behind nursing scrubs and night shifts and the fiction that she could be someone gentle. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she thought, pressing her forehead against the rifle's cool metal. "I promised your daughter I'd never kill again. I promised I'd be better than this." But from somewhere beyond death, she could almost hear Marcus's voice. "Being better doesn't mean being weak. Protect the wounded. That's what we always did." Outside, another scream, another gunshot, another life ended. Sarah lifted the rifle and moved toward the tent entrance. As she did, she caught her reflection in a piece of broken mirror propped against a supply crate. The woman staring back was someone she'd almost forgotten. Hard eyes, set jaw, the expression of someone who'd walked through hell and learned to call it home. The nurse was gone. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, Marine Scout Sniper Call Sign Angel, had returned. She thought of her colleagues huddling in the dark, terrified and helpless. She thought of the patients unable to run, unable to fight, waiting to be executed in their beds. She thought of Corporal Davies, who'd called her a ghost, now lying dead because she'd been too afraid of her past to prevent his future. The guilt would come later. The nightmares would return with a vengeance. The therapy sessions would multiply. She knew all of this with absolute certainty. But knowing didn't change what had to be done. Sarah checked the rifle one final time, her movements smooth and professional. The weapon felt like an old friend, familiar, comfortable, deadly. She'd spent years trying to forget how good she was at this, how naturally killing came to her, how the rifle felt like an extension of her body. 27 confirmed kills, she thought. Tonight that number goes up. She slipped out of the storage tent into the smoke and chaos, moving low and fast toward the water tower. High ground, clear sightlines, overlapping fields of fire. It was the obvious sniper position, which meant it would be undefended because the insurgents expected no resistance from medical personnel. They were about to learn otherwise. As Sarah climbed the metal ladder, rifle slung across her back, she made peace with what she was about to become. Not a hero, not a savior, just a killer with better reasons than most. The night air was cool against her face. Below, the compound burned and bled. In the distance, sirens wailed, reinforcements coming, but too late for those already dead. Sarah reached the top of the tower and settled into a shooting position, the rifle nested against her shoulder like it had never left. Through the scope, the world resolved into crystalline clarity, targets acquired, ranges estimated, solutions calculated. She chambered around, the sound achingly familiar. "Forgive me," she prayed to no one in particular. Then Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, the angel of death, went to work. The world through a rifle scope is a different universe, sharp, intimate, brutal in its clarity. Sarah settled into her shooting position atop the water tower, her body remembering the perfect geometry of death. Left elbow planted, right hand cradling the stock, cheek weld firm against the weapon. Breathing controlled, 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. Below, the compound looked like a vision of hell. Flames from the destroyed generator cast dancing shadows across the tents. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt. And moving through it all, confident and methodical, were the insurgents executing their well-planned massacre. Through her scope, Sarah tracked the nearest target, a bearded man in dark tactical gear moving toward the intensive care unit. He carried his AK-47 with professional competence, pieing corners, checking his six. Former military, Sarah judged. Probably Afghan National Army gone Taliban. Range 175 yards. Wind negligible, maybe 2 miles per hour from the east. Elevation 15 feet. The mathematics of death flowed through her mind like water. Her finger found the trigger. The familiar curve of metal against her skin sent a jolt through her nervous system, part horror, part homecoming. 4 years since she'd felt this. 4 years of pretending this part of her didn't exist. The man stopped outside the ICU tent, shouting orders to someone inside. Through the scope, Sarah could see his face clearly. Young, maybe 25. A scar through his left eyebrow. He was someone's son, maybe someone's father. And he's about to murder 6 helpless patients who can't even get out of bed. Sarah's finger tightened. The trigger broke cleanly, like glass snapping. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a sensation so familiar it was almost comforting. The suppressed report was a quiet crack in the chaos, lost among the other gunfire. Through the scope, she watched the man's head snap backward. He dropped instantly, dead before his body hit the ground. The AK-47 clattered from his hands. 1. Sarah's hands moved automatically, working the bolt action, chambering the next round. No hesitation, no thought, just smooth mechanical efficiency. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd been good at, what she'd tried so desperately to stop being. But there was no time for philosophy. Below, an insurgent was dragging Nurse Chen from the main medical tent by her hair. Chen was screaming, fighting, her small fists beating uselessly against his arm. The insurgent laughed. Sarah could see his teeth even at this distance, and raised his pistol to her head. Sarah's crosshairs found him, adjusted for the angle, for the movement, for the fact that Chen was in close proximity and any mistake would kill her colleague instead of saving her. Breathe, hold, press. The rifle spoke again. The insurgent's laugh transformed into a spray of red mist. He collapsed backward, releasing Chen, who scrambled away sobbing. 2. What the hell? Another insurgent spun toward his fallen comrade, confusion on his face. He hadn't heard the shot over the ambient noise, didn't understand where death had come from. His eyes scanned the compound, looking for threats at ground level. They never looked up. Sarah's third shot took him through the chest, punching through his tactical vest and into his heart. He staggered, looked down at the spreading bloodstain with almost comical surprise, then fell. 3. Now they knew. Someone was shooting. Somewhere in the compound, their easy massacre had met resistance. Sarah saw the remaining insurgents scatter, seeking cover, their confident assault dissolving into confusion. They'd expected sheep and found a wolf instead. Through her scope, Sarah caught movement near the pediatric tent, 2 insurgents trying to flank toward better cover. They moved in bounds, one covering while the other advanced. Professional tactics. These weren't just fighters, they were soldiers. So was she. Sarah led the first runner, tracking his movement, anticipating his path. When he committed to his next bound, she squeezed the trigger. The man went down hard, his momentum carrying him into a tumbling roll that ended in stillness. 4. The second man froze, trapped in the open, suddenly understanding that whoever was shooting could see the entire compound. He made a fatal decision, turned and ran back toward the breach point, hopping speed would save him. It didn't. Sarah's 5th shot caught him mid-stride. He crashed forward, sliding through the dirt, his rifle spinning away. 5. The compound had gone suddenly, eerily quiet. The random gunfire had stopped. The insurgents were pinned down, unable to see their hunter, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to those invisible, impossible shots. Sarah worked the bolt, chambering her last round. 5 shots, 5 kills, just like the old days, just like Iraq, where she'd earned the nickname Angel because enemies died so quickly they never had time to suffer. But she wasn't done, not even close. She'd stuffed additional rounds in her pockets, maybe 20 total, enough to kill every insurgent in this compound if she was perfect. And Sarah Mitchell, when she stopped being a nurse and became a Marine Scout sniper again, was very close to perfect. Below, in the main medical tent, Dr. Patel peered through a gap in the canvas. His eyes went wide when he tracked the trajectory of the last shot back to the water tower, back to Sarah. She could see his face even without the scope, the shock, the disbelief, the sudden terrible understanding. His gentle night nurse, the quiet woman who flinched at loud noises and never raised her voice, was methodically killing their attackers with professional precision. "I'm sorry," Sarah thought, though she didn't stop scanning for targets. "I'm sorry you had to see who I really am." But she wasn't sorry enough to stop. An insurgent broke from cover, sprinting toward the armory building. Sarah tracked him smoothly, her breathing steady, her hands rock solid. The shot was textbook, perfect lead, perfect elevation. The man went down. Zigzag. Another tried to low-crawl toward the fence. Sarah saw him in the firelight, moving slowly, thinking darkness would hide him. She adjusted for the prone target, accounting for the smaller profile. Fired. The crawling stopped. 7. They were panicking now. Sarah could sense it even from her perch. Their confident assault had turned into a nightmare. An invisible enemy was picking them off one by one, and they couldn't fight what they couldn't see. Near the motor pool, 3 insurgents huddled behind a Humvee, arguing in rapid Pashto. Sarah could read their body language. They wanted to retreat, to fall back, to escape whatever supernatural force was killing them. She gave them a choice. Let them run, let them live, or finish what she'd started. Through her scope, Sarah saw one of them grab a radio, calling for reinforcements probably, or maybe calling off the attack. If she let them communicate, more fighters might come, more death, more chaos. The decision took half a second. 3 quick shots. The bolt action worked smoothly between each one, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. All 3 men dropped. 8, 9, 10. Sarah reloaded, her fingers finding fresh rounds in her pocket without looking. The rifle felt alive in her hands, an extension of her will, a tool she understood better than she'd ever understood anything in nursing school. This was her gift, this was her curse. She could save lives with medicine and compassion, or she could save lives with violence and precision. Tonight, compassion wasn't enough. A flash of movement near the chapel, 2 insurgents trying to circle around, attempting to flank her position now that they'd figured out where the shots were coming from. Smart. Too late, but smart. Sarah swung the rifle toward them, tracking smoothly. The first fell before he'd taken 3 steps. The second managed 5 before Sarah's bullet found him. 11, 12. The silence that followed was profound. No more gunfire. No more running footsteps. The surviving insurgents, however many remained, had gone to ground completely, paralyzed by fear of the invisible sniper who never missed. Sarah scanned the compound methodically, quadrant by quadrant, looking for any movement, any threat. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing controlled. She felt nothing, no guilt, no triumph, no satisfaction, just the cold, mechanical focus of a predator culling a herd. This was who she'd been before. This was who she'd tried to stop being. And God help her, she was good at it. In the distance, she heard the rotors of incoming helicopters. Reinforcements finally arriving. Too late for the dead, but soon enough to save the living. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the compound, waiting, watching, patient as death itself. The angel had returned. And she wasn't finished hunting. The helicopters came in low and fast, their rotors beating the air like mechanical thunder. Sarah remained motionless atop the water tower, rifle still pressed to her shoulder, eye still fixed to the scope. Even as the Black Hawks touched down and heavily armed soldiers poured out, she didn't move, couldn't move. Her body had locked into the shooter's position as if her bones had fused with the metal beneath her. "Sniper on the water tower," someone shouted. "WEAPONS hot." Sarah heard boots pounding on the ladder below her, heard the metallic clicks of safeties being released, rifles being aimed at her position. She should put the weapon down, should raise her hands, should do something to show she wasn't a threat. But her hands wouldn't release the rifle. 4 years of trying to forget, and her body had remembered everything in a single night. Now it wouldn't let go. "Drop the weapon, drop it now." The voice was close. Someone had reached the top of the tower. Sarah finally turned her head, moving slowly, carefully. A young Marine stood 3 feet away, his M4 carbine trained on her center mass. He couldn't have been more than 20, his face streaked with camouflage paint, his eyes wide with adrenaline. "Ma'am, I need you to put down the rifle, nice and slow." Sarah looked at him, then back at the compound. In the harsh lights from the helicopters, she could count the bodies scattered across the dirt. 14. She'd killed 14 men in less than 20 minutes. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. "Ma'am." "Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice hoarse and strange. "Marine Corps Scout Sniper, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Service number 2,156,789. I'm putting down the weapon." Her hands finally obeyed, lowering the rifle gently to the platform. The young Marine's eyes widened further. "You're a Marine, but you're wearing scrubs, I know." Sarah stood slowly, keeping her hands visible. "I'm a nurse here, was a nurse, am a nurse." She shook her head, suddenly confused about which identity was real. "The insurgents breached the perimeter. I engaged." More soldiers reached the platform. A captain, 2 sergeants, all staring at her like she was a ghost, which Sarah supposed she was. Captain Morrison, she could read his name tape in the harsh light, keyed his radio. "Sniper secured. Compound secure. Jesus Christ, sir, you need to see this. 14 tangos down, all single shots, all headshots or center mass. Someone get me a sitrep on who the hell this nurse is." The descent from the water tower felt like falling through layers of reality. Each rung of the ladder took her further from the sniper she'd been and closer to the nurse she'd tried to become. But when her feet hit the ground, she didn't know which person she was anymore. Dr. Patel was there, being checked by a medic, his face pale and shocked. When he saw Sarah, he flinched, actually flinched, like she might hurt him. The look in his eyes was worse than any enemy fire she'd ever taken. "Sarah," his voice cracked. "What? Who are you?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she make him understand that the gentle nurse who'd worked beside him for 4 months and the killer who'd just saved his life were the same person? Lieutenant Chen pushed through the crowd, her hair still disheveled from being dragged across the compound, bruises forming on her arms. She stared at Sarah with an expression caught between terror and gratitude. "You saved me," Chen whispered. "You shot that man right next to my head. I felt the bullet pass. How did you?" "I was a Marine," Sarah said flatly. It was all the explanation she could manage. The compound was controlled chaos. Medics triaged the wounded. Military police photographed the dead insurgents. An investigative team had already arrived, documenting the scene with grim efficiency. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still wearing blood-splattered scrubs, still smelling of gunpowder and death. A colonel approached, silver eagles on his collar, hard eyes that had seen too much combat. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Colonel Hendricks, base commander, I need you to walk me through what happened." So she did, clinically, mechanically, like she was describing someone else's actions. The breach, the executions, the decision to arm herself, the shooting positions, the target selection. Her voice never wavered, never broke. She sounded like she was reporting on a successful op, not confessing to breaking the vow that had defined her life for 4 years. Hendricks listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 14 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties after your engagement, perfect marksmanship under extreme stress. He studied her face. You should be proud, Staff Sergeant. Should be, but Sarah felt nothing except a vast, echoing emptiness where her emotions used to live. As dawn broke over the compound, painting everything in shades of red and gold, the full scope of what happened became clear. The insurgents had been professionals, former Afghan National Army, well-armed and well-trained. Their plan had been methodical: kill the guards, breach the perimeter, execute everyone in the hospital, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. It would have worked perfectly. Except for Sarah. The hospital staff gathered near the mess tent, wrapped in shock blankets, drinking coffee they couldn't taste. They watched Sarah from a distance, like she was a dangerous animal that had temporarily stopped attacking. Even the ones whose lives she'd saved couldn't quite look at her directly. Specialist Martinez, the medic who'd grabbed her ankle when she was crawling toward the storage tent, finally approached. His hands were shaking around his coffee cup. "I thought you were running away," he said quietly. "When you crawled out of the tent, I thought you were abandoning us." "I know. Why didn't you tell anyone about being a sniper?" Sarah looked at him, this young medic who'd probably never fired his weapon in combat, and tried to find words that would make sense. "Because I was trying to be someone else, someone who healed instead of killed, someone who could sleep at night without seeing faces." "Did it work?" "For 4 years," Sarah's voice was hollow, "until tonight." The bodies of the insurgents were being loaded into trucks, covered with tarps. Sarah forced herself to watch, forced herself to acknowledge what she'd done. 14 men who would never go home, 14 families who would grieve. She'd killed them to save her colleagues, her patients. There was no question it was justified. But justification didn't erase the weight. Corporal Davies' body was carried past on a stretcher, a flag draped over it. Sarah remembered him joking about her being a ghost. Now he actually was one. She'd killed 14 men, but she hadn't saved Davies, hadn't saved Reynolds. The math of death and salvation didn't balance. "Mitchell," Colonel Hendricks appeared beside her. "I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star, what you did tonight." "Please don't." Sarah's voice was sharp. "I'm not a hero, sir. I'm just someone who forgot to stay forgotten." "You saved over 40 lives." "I took 14. That's not." "With respect, Colonel, it's exactly how it is." Sarah finally looked at him. "I spent 4 years trying to atone for 27 kills. Now it's 41. How many more years of healing do I need to balance that equation?" Hendricks had no answer. As the sun climbed higher, investigators continued their work. Sarah sat on the steps of the destroyed generator building, watching them measure bullet trajectories, photograph blood spatter patterns, document the precise choreography of violence she'd conducted from the water tower. Dr. Patel finally approached, moving carefully, like he was afraid she might bolt or attack. He sat beside her without speaking for a long time. "I looked you up," he said eventually. "Called in some favors. Your service record is impressive. 3 tours, dozens of commendations. They called you the Angel." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Because I delivered death so quietly people thought it was merciful." "Why did you leave?" "My spotter died, Marcus Rodriguez. He had a daughter, Emma, 8 years old. At his funeral she asked me why I couldn't save her daddy. I had no answer." Sarah's voice cracked for the first time. "So I promised her I'd never kill again, that I'd save people instead. I kept that promise for 4 years, Dr. Patel, 4 years, and it took one night to destroy it." Patel was quiet, processing. Finally, "You saved my life tonight, Sarah. Lieutenant Chen's, Martinez's, 43 patients who would have been executed in their beds. That counts for something." "Does it count more than 14 deaths?" "Yes," Patel's voice was firm. "Yes, it absolutely does, and you know what else? You didn't want to kill them. I saw your face when you came down from that tower. You looked destroyed. A killer wouldn't look like that." Sarah turned to him, tears finally breaking through. What am I supposed to be now? I can't go back to just being a nurse. Everyone will know. Everyone will always know what I can do. So be both, Patel said simply. Be the nurse who can protect her patients. Be the warrior who chooses healing. You don't have to be just one thing, Sarah. None of us are just one thing. In the distance, a helicopter lifted off carrying the wounded to larger facilities. Sarah watched it rise into the morning sky, carrying people she'd helped save, in a hospital she'd defended with skills she'd tried to forget. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell. Nurse Sarah Mitchell. The angel. The healer. Maybe Patel was right. Maybe she could be all of those things. Or maybe she'd spend the rest of her life trying to figure out which one was real. 3 months. That's how long it took for Sarah's life to completely unravel and reassemble into something she no longer recognized. The Bronze Star ceremony happened despite her protests. Sarah stood in dress blues she'd thought she'd never wear again, feeling like an imposter as a general pinned the medal to her chest. The citation read like fiction: for exceptional valor in combat, neutralized 14 hostile combatants, saved 43 lives. The numbers were accurate. The story they told was incomplete. What the citation didn't mention: the nightmares that woke her screaming every night. The way her hands shook now when she tried to start an IV. The fact that she couldn't walk into the hospital anymore without seeing blood that wasn't there, hearing screams that had ended months ago. The investigation had cleared her completely. Self-defense, defense of others, justified use of lethal force. Every review board, every inquiry, every formal assessment reached the same conclusion. Staff Sergeant Mitchell had acted with exemplary courage and professional competence. But Sarah knew the truth was more complicated than paperwork could capture. She sat now in a small cafe in Arlington, Virginia, 3 blocks from the cemetery, waiting for someone she'd promised herself she'd never face again. Through the window, autumn leaves drifted down like memories falling from trees. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up and felt her heart constrict. Emma Rodriguez was 16 now, no longer the 8-year-old who'd asked why Sarah couldn't save her daddy. She'd grown tall, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's delicate features. She wore a high school volleyball jacket and carried a backpack covered in band patches. She looked so much like Marcus it hurt. Ms. Mitchell, Emma's voice was uncertain. Sarah stood awkwardly, nearly knocking over her chair. Emma, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. They sat across from each other, the table feeling like an ocean. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times, but now that the moment had arrived, every prepared word evaporated. Mom said you were in the news, Emma said finally. Said you saved a bunch of people in Afghanistan. She showed me the articles. I broke my promise to you. The words tumbled out raw and unfiltered. At your father's funeral, I promised I'd never kill again. I meant it, Emma. I really meant it, but I did. I killed 14 men, and I need you to know that I'm sorry I couldn't keep my word. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. When she looked up, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. I was 8 when Dad died. I didn't really understand what I was asking you to promise. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I blamed you for not saving him. Mom explained later that you weren't even there when the IED went off, that you were in a different position, but I needed someone to be angry at. You had every right. No, I didn't. Emma's voice was firm. I've been thinking about this since Mom told me what happened. You promised to never kill again because an 8-year-old asked you to. That's not fair, that's not. Dad wouldn't have wanted that. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. Your father was the best man I ever knew. He wrote about you, in his letters home. Emma pulled a worn envelope from her backpack. This is from his last deployment, he said, Emma, if anything happens to me, I want you to know that Sarah Mitchell is the person who kept me alive more times than I can count. She's a protector. That's not something you can just stop being." Sarah's hands trembled as Emma pushed the letter across the table. She couldn't read it. The words blurred through her tears. "You didn't break your promise, Ms. Mitchell. You kept being who Dad said you were, a protector." Emma's voice cracked. "Those 43 people got to go home because of you. Their kids didn't have to ask why nobody saved their parents. You did that." They cried together in that cafe, two people bound by loss and guilt and the complicated legacy of a good man who died too young. When they finally composed themselves, Emma pulled out her phone. "Can I show you something?" She scrolled through photos, then turned the screen toward Sarah. "This is me at Dad's grave on Memorial Day. I bring him volleyball game updates. Tell him about school. Mom says it's important to remember who he was, not just how he died." The photo showed Emma kneeling by a white headstone, smiling despite the tears on her face. "I think maybe you need to do the same thing," Emma said gently. "Remember who you are completely, not just the parts that feel safe." Sarah stared at this wise teenager who somehow understood what months of therapy hadn't clarified. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a monster. She was someone complex and capable of both tremendous compassion and necessary violence. The contradiction wasn't a flaw. It was human. They talked for 2 more hours. Emma told stories about Marcus that Sarah had never heard. How he couldn't cook anything except grilled cheese. How he cried at Disney movies. How he'd wanted to be a teacher after he retired from the Marines. Sarah shared memories too. Marcus singing off-key during long observation posts. His terrible jokes that somehow always landed. His absolute certainty that every Marine under his watch would make it home. "He didn't make it home," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry for that every single day." "I know." Emma reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "But you made it home, and you're still protecting people. Dad would be proud of that. I'm proud of that." When they parted on the street outside, Emma hugged her. A fierce, tight embrace that felt like absolution Sarah didn't know she needed. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Mitchell. The world needs more protectors." Sarah watched her walk away, this remarkable young woman who'd somehow managed to forgive what Sarah couldn't forgive in herself. She pulled out her phone and made a call she'd been avoiding for 3 months. "Fort Sam Houston, Combat Medic Training Battalion. This is Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling about the instructor position that was offered to me." The voice on the other end perked up. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, we'd be honored to have you. When can you start?" Sarah looked up at the clear Virginia sky, thinking about all the contradictions she contained. Warrior and healer, killer and savior, broken and whole. 2 weeks, I need to do something first." She drove to Arlington Cemetery, parked and walked until she found Marcus's grave. The headstone was simple, his name, his rank, his dates. Someone, probably Emma, had left fresh flowers. Sarah knelt in the grass, her hand resting on the cold marble. "I broke my promise, Marcus, but Emma helped me understand something. You never asked me to stop being a protector. You never asked me to stop being who I am. That was all me, trying to erase the parts of myself I didn't like." The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. "I'm going to train combat medics, teach them to heal and to protect, to be both things at once, because sometimes you have to be both." Sarah's voice steadied. "I'm not going to apologize anymore for being good at keeping people alive, even when it means being good at other things too." She stood brushing grass from her knees. The weight she'd carried for 8 years, since Marcus died, since she made an impossible promise, since she tried to become someone she wasn't, finally began to lift. Sarah Mitchell walked back to her car, past rows of white headstones marking other complicated lives reduced to simple dates. She wasn't just a sniper, wasn't just a nurse. She was both, and everything in between. 3 weeks later, she stood in front of her first class at Fort Sam Houston. 25 combat medics, fresh-faced and eager, about to learn that saving lives in war zones required more than medical knowledge. "My name is Staff Sergeant Mitchell," she began. "I'm going to teach you how to keep yourselves and your patients alive, because sometimes the best way to heal is to make sure nothing gets close enough to cause harm in the first place." She looked at their young faces and saw Emma, saw Marcus, saw every patient she'd ever saved and every enemy she'd ever killed. All of it was part of who she was. All of it mattered. "Let's get started." And finally, 8 years after Marcus died, 4 years after she tried to bury her past, and 3 months after that past had violently resurfaced, Sarah Mitchell began to heal. Not by forgetting who she'd been, but by accepting who she was. Both the angel and the nurse. The warrior and the healer. Complete 3 months after the attack, Sarah Mitchell stood at Gate 17 of Arlington National Cemetery, her hands trembling around a small bouquet of white roses. She'd been to this cemetery before, for military funerals, for memorial services, for the annual remembrance of fallen Marines. But she'd never visited his grave, never allowed herself that particular form of torture. Until today. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October day that made everything feel sharp and real. Sarah wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple black sweater, boots, because she couldn't bear the weight of her uniform right now. The bronze star pinned to her dress blues hung in her closet at home, a piece of metal that felt more like an accusation than an honor. She found Section 60 easily. This was where the recent wars lived, where Iraq and Afghanistan carved their names into white marble. The rows stretched out like soldiers at attention, each headstone marking a life interrupted, a family broken, a future erased. Marcus Rodriguez's grave was in the 3rd row, beneath an oak tree just beginning to turn gold. Sarah's breath caught when she saw it. Someone had been here recently. Fresh flowers sat in the built-in vase, and a small volleyball keychain lay propped against the stone. Emma, of course Emma had been here. Sarah knelt in the grass, her knees sinking into the soft earth, and placed her roses beside her daughter's flowers. For a long moment, she just stared at the inscription. Staff Sergeant, MRCUSJ RODRIGUZ. United States Marine Corps. March 15, 1985, July 23, 2017. Beloved father-son Marine. Always faithful. 9 years. He'd been dead for 9 years, and Sarah had spent every single day trying to justify why she survived when he didn't. "I broke my promise, Marcus." Her voice cracked in the empty cemetery. "I told Emma I'd never kill again. I meant it. God, I meant it so much, but I did it anyway. 14 men. 14. A breeze rustled through the oak leaves, making them whisper like voices. "The worst part," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face. "The worst part is how easy it was, how quickly I became that person again. I climbed that tower and it was like I'd never left, like the 4 years of nursing school and therapy and trying to be someone different just disappeared. And I was good at it, Marcus. I'm so fucking good at killing people." She pressed her forehead against the cold marble, her shoulders shaking with sobs she'd held back for months. "Everyone keeps calling me a hero. The Marine Corps wants me back. The hospital doesn't know what to do with me. My colleagues look at me like I'm a stranger. And maybe I am. Maybe I was always a stranger pretending to be normal." "You're not a stranger." Sarah's head snapped up. 20 feet away stood a woman in her early 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray and Marcus's same warm brown eyes. Maria Rodriguez, Marcus's mother, watched her with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was." Sarah scrambled to her feet, wiping her face. "I come every Sunday morning." Maria walked closer, carrying her own flowers, bright yellow daisies, Marcus's favorite. "Emma told me you might come today. She said you two talked." Sarah's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. If I had been there, if I had seen the IED, if I had. Stop. Maria's voice was firm but not unkind. She set her daisies down, then turned to face Sarah fully. I spent 2 years blaming you. 2 years thinking if Marcus's sniper had been better, faster, more aware, my son would still be alive. Emma told me you've spent 9 years thinking the same thing. I should have saved him. You were 300 yards away in a different position. Maria's voice softened. I know because I read the after-action report so many times I memorized it. You couldn't have seen that IED. Nobody could have. And you know what Marcus's last words were? Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. The corpsman who tried to save him said Marcus kept saying, "Tell Angel she did everything right. Tell her I said perfect shot." He was talking about the insurgent you killed that morning, the one who was about to ambush his squad. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Even dying, Marcus was trying to make sure you knew he was grateful. Sarah's knees buckled. Maria caught her, and suddenly they were both kneeling in the grass, holding each other, crying for a man they'd both loved and lost. I don't know how to live with what I am, Sarah whispered. I don't know how to be both the person who saves lives and the person who takes them. Then maybe, Maria said gently, pulling back to look at Sarah's face, you need to stop trying to be one or the other. Maybe you need to accept that you're both. That being both is what makes you extraordinary. Over the next hour, sitting in the grass beside Marcus's grave, Maria told Sarah stories she'd never heard. How Marcus had talked about his sniper constantly in his letters home. How proud he'd been to work with one of the few women to earn that title. How he'd told his mother that Sarah Mitchell was the kind of Marine who made everyone around her better, stronger, braver. He never once said you were just a killer, Maria said. He said you were a guardian. There's a difference. As the sun climbed higher, other visitors began arriving. Families with children, veterans in aging uniforms, a widow placing a teddy bear on her husband's grave. The cemetery filled with quiet grief and stubborn love. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Maria the email she'd received that morning from Fort Sam Houston, her official orders to report as a combat medic instructor. 25 students in her first class, all of them learning to be healers in a world that often required fighters. What will you teach them? Maria asked. The truth. Sarah looked at Marcus's headstone, then at his mother's face. That protecting people sometimes means using violence. That healing and fighting aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same commitment. That you can carry both without letting either one destroy you. Marcus would approve. Maria stood brushing grass from her knees. Come, walk with me. They walked through Section 60 together, past hundreds of graves, each one a story of service and sacrifice. Maria talked about Marcus's childhood, his dreams, his terrible cooking, and his beautiful heart. Sarah listened and began to understand something fundamental. Marcus hadn't died because she failed. He died because war is chaos and loss is inevitable, and sometimes good people don't come home. But that didn't mean she had to stop being who she was to honor his memory. At the cemetery gate, Maria hugged Sarah tightly. Come back, she said. Visit him, talk to him, and stop punishing yourself for surviving. Marcus would hate that. Sarah watched her drive away, then turned back toward the rows of white stones. The sun was warm on her face. Birds sang in the trees. Life continued, complicated and messy and worth protecting. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, Marine Scout sniper, combat nurse, instructor, protector. She was all of these things. The contradictions didn't need resolving. They needed accepting. She walked back to her car, ready to report to Fort Sam Houston, ready to teach a new generation how to hold life and death in the same careful hands. The reckoning was over. The healing could finally begin.